National Energy Grid is set for a restructure, with the country's largest coal-fired power station to close 7 years earlier than expected. Origin Energy announced yesterday it was bringing forward the closure of the Eraring plant in New South Wales from 2032 to 2025. It's the largest coal plant in Australia, a capacity of more than 2,800 megawatts. In its place, Origin wants to install a 700 megawatt battery, a move the Energy Minister Angus Taylor says is delusional. On top of this, AGL has recently brought forward the closure of two coal plants, one in New South Wales and the other in Victoria. For more on this, let's bring in Tony Wood, Energy Program Director at the Grattan Institute. Thanks very much for your time. Just starting with that gap. So you read the headline, 2,800 megawatts is shutting down. A 700 megawatt battery, so it's a battery for one thing, it's not the same generation capability, and it's much smaller. Is there a problem here? Is there an instant and obvious gap?
Well, if that's all you compared, then yeah, I guess the answer is obviously yes. And to that extent, Angus Taylor's absolutely right. But the reality is that that's only one of the things that's going to be necessary to replace Eraring in 3.5 years' time. And a lot of the things that will replace Eraring have already been committed, such as other battery storage, such as more renewables, such as gas, and such as even Snowy Hydro. So it's all of those things together, Tom, that will replace Eraring, not just the one 700 megawatt battery, which is important and a big investment, but that's not the only thing that's going to be necessary.
Okay, so when we look at our energy projects that are slated, as well as those that are exiting the market over the next few years, I've seen different things put out there around there not being a gap, but we're going to have a huge surplus. Is that accurate? Are the projects you spoke about, are they coming online? Will we have concerns about reliability or price?
Well, if we do this well, we should have no concerns about reliability or price. But we haven't done it well so far. I mean, the very issue that's causing Origin to announce or advise of a closure of Eraring in 2025 is oversupply in the market, caused by very strong support for renewable energy. That by itself is fine, but without making sure we've got a market which provide price signals for all those other things we've just been mentioning, Tom. And so whilst it might be possible for the government to cause this to happen, the government could build some of this stuff, as the government's doing with Kurri Kurri gas-fired power station by Snowy Hydro, which it owns. It's all the other things that are necessary, and we need very clear price signals. So one thing that should come out of this issue of closure of coal-fired power stations has been around for years. We've known it was coming, and we industry, governments, have not got on top of it. This may be the trigger that really causes us to focus on what has to be done to provide the incentives for the companies to invest in all those things that are necessary. And yes, there's plenty of time to get it done, but we can't muck around much longer.
But isn't this supposed to be being addressed at the moment? Because the government had a couple of things in place, making sure we were forewarned about closures, which I guess is why we have a bit longer around this announcement, but also power companies being paid for reliable power, for baseload power. So why isn't this doing the job you just spoke about?
Well, we haven't put it in place yet. This issue of a form of capacity payment, capacity market in all various different forms. I won't bore you or the viewers with that sort of complexity. But this has been around now for several years. You could remember Josh Frydenberg was minister and Malcolm Turnbull was prime minister. The latter partly lost his job over this issue of what was then called the National Energy Guarantee. All the industry was behind a combination of a reliability mechanism and an emissions reduction mechanism, putting both in place and then require the market to solve that at lowest cost. We've not done it. We're talking about it. We've been creeping up on it, but we haven't done it yet. And that's where the absolute important gap is. And maybe, as I said, this could be a trigger for really getting serious about it.
So there's no reliability mechanism at the moment in place in any form?
Well, there's a mixture. We have a reliability standard, but it's not the sort of thing that would trigger the investment in what we're talking about. New South Wales, and Matt Keane's talked about this in the last 24 hours, has another form of reliability standard, and it's trying to ensure that we again have renewable energy and reliability at the same time. Now, it's a bit clunkier than we should have, but in some ways you could say, well, Matt Keane has done what's necessary because we haven't seen a coordinated national approach through the Forum of Ministers, the Ministerial Council, of which Angus Taylor is the chair, putting in place across the national energy market those sorts of mechanisms that would do the sort of thing we're talking about. As I said, we have a reliability standard, but it's not what's necessary to address the sort of changing market that we're seeing with more and more renewables and the exit of fossil fuel power stations.
So as you see it right now, in terms of the two big things, I guess there are three. Emissions coming down is one part of what needs to happen in our electricity grid, but that seems to be happening anyway. The other two being reliability and price. Are there legitimate concerns right now?
Well, there's always concerns, but that just means we've got to put in place the things to address those concerns. And you can't take out, but as you said at the beginning, the biggest single source of supply in a market and not expect some consequences. If Eraring was to stay there, of course prices would be lower than without it. But that just is a false premise, because that was never going to happen. I mean, the timing of this is important, but it was never going to stay here. And so whenever these things leave, you see price movements. Now, whether those price movements then trigger investment, which then brings prices back down again, which we did see happen in Hazelwood. Now, in the case of Hazelwood in Victoria, the whole thing was over a much shorter time frame because they only provided 5 months' notice. In this case, we've got 3.5 years' notice, and the market's got time to respond. So that's what will happen. Whether or not those higher wholesale prices, which trigger investment, then flow through to retail customers, depends upon how well we implement the sort of things that are necessary.